When Maren Ellis drove through the rusted gates of Oakstone Estate after 20 years, the iron groaned like it recognized her. The once manicured gardens were overtaken with wild thorns and broken stone fountains, the grand colonial house now sagging under the weight of rot, mold, and the secrets it could no longer hold together. She stepped out of her silver rental car in silence, her heels crunching the gravel driveway that once echoed with her father's booming laughter, her mother's polite scolds, and the distant hum of family barbecues that masked the dysfunction burning underneath. Oakstone hadn't been her home in a long time. It was the place that had unraveled her. At 17, Maren had been the black sheep, the outspoken daughter, the one who asked too many questions, who didn't smile on cue at family photo ops, and the one who refused to stay silent when her uncle Daniel started correcting her behavior with rough hands and gaslit threats. When she tried to speak out, they'd called her unstable, attention-seeking, mentally fragile. Her mother had cried behind closed doors but never defended her in public. Her father, Lowell Ellis, the patriarch of the Ellis lumber empire, had said, "This family doesn't air its dirty laundry, Maren. The solution? A private institution in Vermont." A press release that framed her breakdown as a necessary step in her recovery. And then silence. But Maren hadn't gone silent. She had survived. She changed her name, rebuilt her life, and became what they feared most, someone with a voice backed by proof. She became a trauma researcher, then a best-selling author, and, finally, a legal advocate who helped other silenced girls find the courage to testify. But she'd never returned to Oakstone. Not until now. The estate had gone into foreclosure following her father's sudden death from a stroke and her uncle Daniel's mysterious disappearance after a sexual assault settlement. What the world didn't know was that Maren had quietly bought the rights to the estate through a shell trust 2 years earlier. She'd waited patiently, methodically until the rest of the Ellis empire cracked. And now, it was hers, not out of sentiment, out of purpose. Inside the house, it smelled like mildew and mold, the scent of history left to rot. She moved through the grand hallways like someone walking through a mausoleum. In the study, the mahogany desk where her father had once signed $1 million contracts now held dust-covered ledgers and the remnants of shattered whiskey bottles. She touched none of it. Not yet. Instead, she opened the locked drawer beneath the bookshelf, the one she remembered hiding under during fights, the one she'd once seen her father and uncle whispering over with hushed urgency. The key had long been discarded, but Maren had hired someone months ago to prepare the place for her arrival. Inside the drawer were boxes of family ledgers, old letters, and most importantly an envelope marked trust accounts, Ellis Timber Holdings 2001 to 2004. She smiled grimly. That was the year she had been institutionalized. That was the year nearly $800,000 disappeared from a fund originally meant for her education and future. That was when the real erasure had begun. The town of Brookhaven, Georgia, hadn't changed much. The same crooked calf sign still blinked near the square, and the same people, older now, stiffer, still walked with polite pride and convenient forgetfulness. But they remembered her. Even with the name change, even with the hair darker and the posture straighter, they knew. Whispers followed her through every room she entered. "Is that Maren? Didn't she write that book about being locked away? I thought she moved to New York." She let them talk. She wasn't here for their redemption. She was here to shatter a story they had helped protect. Her first move came quietly, a podcast episode she'd pre-recorded, dropping anonymously, but strategically, titled "The Ones Who Knew and Said Nothing." It wasn't just about her. It was about the families who rewrote their sins into fairy tales and forced the victims to carry the shame. Within 2 days, it was trending, but that was only the beginning. She had collected testimonies from 3 former estate staff members now in their 60s and 70s who had finally broken their silence about Mr. Daniel's behavior. 2 former employees at the Vermont institution had signed affidavits confirming that her admittance had been orchestrated under false pretenses, supported by hush money wired from Ellis Timber Holdings. And most devastating of all, she had unearthed a notarized letter from her late grandmother hidden in the family Bible where she had written, "If you're reading this, Maren, I always believed you." Her grandmother, The only person who had ever tried to protect her had been silenced in the will. But her words survived. Now, with every piece gathered, Maren began writing again, not another book, but a legal complaint. She wasn't after money. She wanted accountability. Her lawsuit would name not just the late Lowell Ellis, but the trustees, the institutional partners, and the estate itself. She would name the town of Brookhaven in a civil negligence claim for protecting a predator. She was going to make history, and she would do it in the same courtroom her father had once donated money to renovate. The day the lawsuit was filed, the town of Brookhaven woke up as if from a long, deep slumber, only to realize it had been sleeping through a fire. Headlines flooded every corner of the community. Oakstone legacy under fire. Maren Ellis files explosive civil suit alleging abuse, fraud, and systemic cover-up. It wasn't just the local papers anymore, it was national. Major outlets picked up the story within hours, fueled by Maren's already public reputation as an author and advocate. She hadn't used a pseudonym this time. No more hiding. The documents names her father, her uncle, the former head of the Vermont facility, and 2 trustees from the Ellis Foundation who had quietly signed off on reallocating her trust fund under the guise of medical necessity. The complaint even included notarized staff statements describing the manipulations they had witnessed but were too afraid to stop. Maren didn't flinch. While her inbox flooded with press requests and social media erupted with hashtags, she remained focused. Her lawyer, a fierce Atlanta woman named Nadine, had warned her about the backlash, the gaslighting, the "how dare you do this to your own family" crowd. But Maren was ready. She'd faced isolation, manipulation, and institutional silence before. She wasn't 17 anymore. She was the storm that followed silence. Martin Blake, the Ellis family's longtime attorney, tried damage control the old-fashioned way. Press releases filled with vague regrets and respect for the privacy of the deceased began to circulate. A week later, a glossy, rehearsed video appeared on a Brookhaven business Facebook page, featuring a few town elders reminiscing about Lowell Ellis's contributions to the community and subtly discrediting Maren as someone who always seemed troubled. It was textbook misdirection. But Maren had anticipated it. That same day, she authorized the release of audio recordings, one taken when she was 15, where her uncle's voice could be clearly heard berating her behind a locked door, calling her damaged and threatening to have her put away again if she doesn't stop talking. She had carried that tape for over a decade, tucked into the spine of a journal, waiting for the day it would finally matter. And now it did. Public sentiment began to shift, not because people were good, but because they were afraid to be on the wrong side of a public reckoning. Brookhaven's pride, its Ellis legacy, had become its liability. Meanwhile, Oakstone Estate, now legally and publicly Maren's, became more than a house. It became a symbol. She opened its gates for the first time in decades and hosted what she called the Truth Gathering, an open community event with no cameras, no reporters, just people, survivors, women and men who had grown up in silence, who had been forced to walk past their abusers at church or school or family dinners, came and stood in that once forbidden space, finally allowed to speak. Maren stood among them, not as a leader, but as one of them. She didn't tell her story, she listened. She offered the space, the tea, the quiet, the permission. What bloomed there wasn't loud, it was honest. And that honesty scared the people who had built their lives on pretense. Council members who had once smiled in family portraits with the Ellises now scrambled to make statements of neutrality. Old friends who had ghosted her in her teens sent half-hearted DMs. Even her estranged mother, living now in a retirement condo 3 towns over, called for the first time in 15 years, her voice brittle. "Maren, why now?" she asked. And Maren, with a voice calm and steady, replied, "Because I survived, and you let them erase that." Then she hung up, her hand steady, her heart unshaken. But not all battles were external. Every night, when the estate went quiet and the guests left and the air grew thick with southern stillness, Maren sat in the same study where her father once made deals and said nothing while she cried for help. She would stare at the portraits on the wall, Lowell with his ever-charming smile, Daniel with his snake oil grin and wonder how many lies could hang on a wall before the frame collapsed. And then she'd write, page after page, not for publication, for memory, for herself. She wrote her younger self letters. She wrote apologies her family never gave. She wrote down the names of girls she'd met in courtrooms across the country, girls whose stories never made headlines but deserved to be remembered anyway. And in that quiet practice, she wasn't just building a case. She was reclaiming time. By the end of the month, the first pretrial hearing was scheduled, and the judge approved the inclusion of sealed institutional files as admissible evidence, a landmark win. Maren showed up to the courthouse in a navy suit, no entourage, no makeup, just presence. Reporters crowded the steps, but she said nothing. She didn't need to speak. The file she handed to her lawyer spoke louder than any quote ever could. Hundreds of pages, including an internal memo written by the Vermont Institutions Board, dated the month of her admittance. It read, "Patient admitted at request of donor family. No clinical diagnosis required." That memo alone would gut the credibility of every excuse her father ever made. It was proof that the world didn't fail Maren Ellis because she was wrong, it failed her because she was inconvenient. The courthouse buzzed with restrained electricity as the case entered its third week, and Maren Ellis, no longer a whisper, no longer erased, became the woman at the center of a national reckoning. News outlets ran daily coverage. Pundits debated on air whether this was revenge or redemption, and survivors across the country began holding signs that read, "I believe Maren," outside institutions that once buried their truths. But Maren didn't care for headlines. She was after something much heavier: structural accountability. Her legal team, relentless and unflinching, called to the stand former trustees who'd spent years siphoning her trust fund into Ellis Foundation. Medical grants. Their statements cracked under pressure. One tearfully admitted they were just following Lowell's orders, and that everyone thought it was best to keep the matter private. That phrase, "keep it private," echoed through the courtroom like a curse. It was the same phrase Maren had heard whispered around her whole life. And now, it was poison. The most damning moment came when her uncle Daniel was subpoenaed to appear, flown in from a quiet exile in South Carolina. He shuffled into the courtroom with sunken eyes and trembling hands, the weight of decades of secrecy bearing down on him. His lawyer objected, tried to block him from testifying, but the judge overruled. Under oath, Daniel was asked a single question: "Did you ever touch your niece inappropriately or use your influence to silence her?" There was a long pause. The silence grew unbearable. Then, almost inaudibly, he muttered, "I don't remember." That cowardly answer said more than a confession ever could. Public outrage exploded. A leaked video of the testimony went viral within hours. Maren's team didn't orchestrate it, but they didn't stop it either. The town of Brookhaven, once the Ellis family's kingdom, now reeled from the fallout. Schools removed the Ellis name from plaques and libraries. A mural downtown depicting Lowell as a local hero was defaced overnight with red paint spelling the word liar. But the blowback wasn't just symbolic. Civil suits from other victims began to surface: former students, estate workers, and even a neighbor who had once tried to report something strange but had been dismissed by the police chief, who was now retired and very quiet. What had once been Maren's lonely fight was now a cascade. Her story opened the floodgates. And still, she didn't grandstand. She walked into the courtroom each day wearing the same gold locket her grandmother had left her, the same calm expression, and the same purpose in her spine. She never once looked at Daniel. He didn't deserve to see what strength looked like outside. The courtroom, Oakstone, transformed. The gardens, once strangled in vines, now bloomed again with marigolds and purple sage. Volunteers from the town helped rebuild the crumbling gazebo where Maren's mother once read poetry aloud on summer nights. Every corner of the estate was being redefined, not restored to former glory, but reshaped into something true. Maren dedicated the West Wing to what she called the Archive of the Silenced, a permanent exhibit showcasing letters, testimonials, and artifacts from victims who had been institutionalized, discredited, or punished for telling the truth. Some were local, some were national. All of them were echoes of a story that had once nearly swallowed her whole. But Maren didn't flinch when she walked through the archive. She stood tall beside every framed document, every photo, every voice made visible again. She had promised herself long ago that if she ever got out, really got out, she'd make it impossible for anyone else to be buried the way she was done in private. Maren allowed herself stillness, but never weakness. She spent her evenings journaling on the back porch beneath the oaks, her pen moving as though it remembered things her body hadn't yet processed. Sometimes she'd hear the wind push through the broken upper windows and remember the screams she'd once muffled into her pillow. But they no longer paralyzed her. They were background noise now, not the whole story. She was no longer trapped inside the trauma. She was walking above it. And when the sun dipped below the trees and the cicadas sang their dusk song, she felt her grandmother's presence more clearly than ever. "They don't get the last word," she whispered one night, the fireflies blinking in agreement. "We do." The trial neared its final stretch with closing arguments that painted two stark realities. One, of a legacy family wronged by a bitter daughter trying to rewrite history. The other, of a woman who survived being erased and returned not for vengeance, but for restoration. Maren never asked the jury to believe her. She simply told the truth. "They didn't fail me because I was weak," she said. "They failed me because I was inconvenient. I made them uncomfortable, and instead of facing themselves, they threw me away." The courtroom was silent again, this time not from shame, but reverence. The weight of her words settled over every listener like smoke from a slow, controlled burn, the kind of fire that doesn't destroy, but clears space for something new. The verdict came on a still, cloudless morning, the kind that felt suspended in time, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The courtroom buzzed with press and murmurs, but Maren sat unmoved in the front row, her hands clasped calmly. In her lap, the gold locket from her grandmother resting against her chest like armor. When the jury foreperson stood, his voice didn't shake. "We find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." A collective exhale rippled through the room. Damages were awarded, reputations officially dismantled, and the Ellis legacy, once built on oak and money and silence, was now legally documented as a monument to abuse, coercion, and betrayal. But Maren didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, the quiet grace of someone who knew that justice doesn't come with applause, but with weight lifted. The story hit national news within minutes. Maren Ellis wins landmark case against family estate, the woman who refused to stay buried. But it wasn't the headlines that mattered, it was the ripples. The institution in Vermont announced a full internal audit. A new law was proposed in Georgia requiring third-party oversight for all psychiatric facility admissions involving minors. And dozens of survivors across the country came forward, saying that Maren's case gave them the strength to speak. Back in Brookhaven, the town moved with the awkward guilt of someone waking from a long denial. Store owners who once whispered about that troubled Ellis girl now offered free coffee, ashamed smiles, or gentle acknowledgments. Maren accepted none of it. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. She wasn't there to be forgiven by the town that had abandoned her. She had never needed their validation, only their accountability. She declined all TV interviews, all publishing deals for a follow-up memoir. Instead, she hosted a final event at Oakstone. No press, no cameras, just those who had walked similar paths. They came from across the country, women and men whose stories had been swallowed by powerful families, churches, schools. They filled the restored Oakstone garden like ghosts brought back to life, sitting on picnic blankets beneath the trees, trading stories, not as victims, but as witnesses. There was music, laughter, even a little dancing near the old stone fountain, now blooming with lilies. In the center of the garden stood a marble plaque Maren had unveiled just that morning. It read, "For those who were told they were too much, too loud, too broken. We hear you now." Maren's mother never showed up again, not during the trial, not after the verdict, not even when the estate formally changed ownership. That chapter, Maren decided, would remain closed. Some wounds didn't need letters or closure, they just needed to be left behind. But one day, an unmarked envelope arrived in the mail at Oakstone. Inside was a photo of Maren as a baby, her grandmother holding her beneath the garden oak tree, both of them smiling as if they already knew the world would try to silence them. There were no words in the envelope, Only that photo. Maren placed it in the archive of the silenced, framed next to her grandmother's handwritten note. It felt right there, not a statement of sadness, but a reminder of lineage, of legacy that lived through survival, not silence. As the months passed, Oakstone evolved into more than a restored estate. It became a refuge, a symbol, a place for healing retreats, survivor circles, policy workshops. Maren created scholarships, funded by the damages awarded to her, bearing no Ellis name, only first names of women who had once been forgotten. Her days were full, but not rushed. Her nights were quiet, but not lonely. Occasionally, she'd wander into the old study with a mug of tea and stare at the empty space where her father's portrait once hung. She had taken it down the night of the verdict and burned it in the fireplace. The flames had flickered high and bright, but they weren't filled with anger. They were cleansing. She never replaced the portrait. She left the wall bare, save for a single quote painted in soft gold lettering. She remembered who she was, and the silence couldn't hold her anymore. One autumn afternoon, a little girl visiting with her mother for a trauma education workshop wandered into the garden and found Maren sitting beneath the oak tree. "Is this your house?" the girl asked, her hair in messy braids, her voice sweet and curious. Maren looked around at the garden, the wind-brushed branches, the plaque glinting in the light, and said, "It's ours now." The girl sat beside her, plucked a yellow flower, and tucked it behind Maren's ear. Then she ran off, giggling, leaving a breeze in her wake and something softer in Maren's chest than she had felt in years. And in that moment, surrounded by everything once taken from her, truth, time, belonging, Maren knew she had not just won. She had rebuilt, not the Ellis legacy, but something better, a place where no one had to be erased to feel safe. A story that began in betrayal, but ended in bloom.